Given the current situation, probably we are witnessing another global war, although that's yet to be certain. I will personally call it World War Five. There are two reasons. One, the Family Guy joke. Second, I consider the Cold War as World War Three and the Global War on Terror as World War Four. But regardless, this global war that may or may not is happening as we speak was started by the combined might of fascist Israel, which is functioned under the principles of a settled colonial with the apartheid state. And Zionism equals fascism. Yes, I said that. Fight me. Second of all, with the combined might of Israel and the United States under the Nazi monarchist government Donald Trump, which, according to Trump v. USA, the president is above the law. It is, by all accounts, an all but named electoral monarchy. Under a fascist dictatorship, Trumpism is a form of fascism, a new form of fascism. Well, to understand this, we need to understand how the people react when fascism first arose somewhere in the 1910s to 1930. I said this before and I'll say this again. Fascism can trace its roots and its philosophical origins at the United States itself, especially with the US founding fathers. The writings of Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, Alexander Hamilton, and others laid the foundation for fascism. If you look at the chronological history of fascist thinking and proto-fascist thinking from the United States, France, Spain, Germany, Austria, Italy, etc., all these people have something common, which all the founding fathers also have, which is a belief in a natural hierarchy and aristocracy, a belief in a racial supremacy, a belief that colonialism and imperialism is a good thing. So there's that. So it's like we need to understand how this goes. And there are great writings about how people reacted to these early developments of fascism. There are three if they I would like to read. Before that, I need to talk about something else. There's an interesting scholarly book called The Anarchist Individualist Origins of Fascism, which is a autobiography of three anarchists plus one is the socialist politician. They were considered themselves individualist anarchists. If you read the history, the author himself, the scholar, said anarchists have played little to no role in the development of fascism. These individual anarchists were actually kicked from the individual anarchist movements themselves. Many of them became monarchists in the end of their lives and believed in a dream this libertarian aristocracy. In fact, the earliest example to develop fascist movement was the Circle Brujon, it's the image you see in the background, where a bunch of monarchists trying to recruit anarchists within their circle, trying to convince them to become monarchists using the very botched reading of Brujon. Even though they only develop surface level understanding like direct action and using the workers like syndicates in their favor while ignoring and outright rejecting his more fundamental philosophies of rejection of hierarchy to state and centralized authority. So these are articles are written around this time when fascism was first developed as a mass movement. And there are three of them I will read for you to see how they develop over time. First is written by Luigi Fabbri in 1921, Fascism: Preventing the Counter-Revolution. The anarchists and revolutionary syndicalists in Italy trying to spur the Italian workers on the revolution, taking a leading role in the factory occupations that spread across Italy in 1920, which they hope will mark the beginning of a general exploration and social revolution. The more moderate social parties affected compromise, and then Mussolini and the fascists began their counter-revolution in earnest. With support of the bourgeoisie and the government, El Malatesta, the anarcho-syndicalists, Armando Borghi, and many other anarchists were arrested in October 1920. Within weeks of the ending of the factory occupations, Luigi Fabi was a friend of Malatesta, co-editor of Umanità Nova, and a notable anarchist propagandist. He's one of the first to provide anarchist analysis of fascism in his 1921 publication, Fascism: Preventing the Counter-Revolution. The following excerpt has been translated by Paul Sherkby. The fascist phenomenon, not particularly to Italy, it has surfaced in even more serious form in Spain. It has raised its head in Germany, Hungary, the Americas, and elsewhere. No were persecutions and unlawful reaction mounted by private citizens unknown prior to World War. In certain respects, they have predecessors in pogroms in Russia and the lynchings of the United States. What is more, the United States has always had sort of private police in the service of the capitalists, acting in cahoots with the official police, but independently of government, in troubled times and during strikes. Fascism, guerrilla warfare between fascists and socialists, or to be more accurate, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, is nothing but the natural unleashed and material consequence of the class hostilities honed during the First World War and gravitate by a number of secondary circumstances and factors, which only appear, and then only briefly, to have distorted its character, which triumphs and comes to the fore when less expected. With the war there emerged the greatest proletariat unanimity against the ruling class, and this led to the extraordinary deepening of the gulf between the classes, with the one regarded to the other as a declared the enemy, and in particular the ruling class, seeing its power threatened, lost its head. What disturbed it most, perhaps, was the feeling that could not defend itself except through recourse to violence and civil war, which in theory, through its laws, it has always condemned. It was undermining the very foundation and principle upon which the bourgeoisie had been constructed its institution for close to a century. The proletarian menace willed the ruling class, of which fascism today constitutes a sort of militia and the rallying point, into a bloc. And the ruling class is not compromised solely of the bourgeois proper. It compromise is made up also of the most backward-looking strata, all the castes that equal out a parasitic existence under the aegis of the state, who man its rampants. Those who supply the government and the protected industry, the police grow to mammoth proportion these days. The upper bureaucracy and judiciary are all of them more or less fascistic in outlook. And to these the land-owning bourgeoisie, which is backward-looking by nature and tradition and always has its back to the war of peasant demands, which in the long run it could not withstand except by renouncing all profit, which is to say the very privilege the property confers. The fascists proper, the ones with the badge of their labels, are relatively few in number, but derive their strength from the close ranks, direct and indirect aid, and poorly concealed complicity of all the various conservative forces in society. It is primarily as the organization and agent of the violent armed defense of the ruling class against the proletariat, which it to their mind had become undoubtedly demanding, united, and intrusive. That fascism represents a continuation of the war. It would be too simplistic to say World War was sort of international war on the proletariat against the revolution. There were other equally important factors and motives behind the war. But it is a fact that one of the things that triggered the conflict in Europe, one of the factors why no ruling class in any country, not in France, not in Germany, not in Russia, not in Austria, not in England, not in Italy, did what could have been done to avert war, was precisely the hope that each of them had been spared revolution, decapitating a working class that had become overtly strong, diffusing popular resistance through bloodletting on a vast scale, consolidating crown heads, especially the rule of the banking and industrial plutocracy. Many have, as the saying goes, paid the price for this. Once the floodgates were opened, the surging current swept away from many of the crown's heads of Germany, Russia, Austria, and etc. But everybody played his hand in the hope of emerging as the winner, which is to say, by defeating not just the enemy at the other side of the border, but also the enemy within, the organized proletarian, socialism, and revolution. The sudden strength of fascism is the sort of strength that corresponds to the broad causal of interest, all the interests, ambitions, and power under the threat from revolution, socialism, and the proletariat. In this sense, it was just what the conservatives needed precisely, because the classic forms of reaction were inadequate or damning. On the other hand, states had to be allowed to keep out the periods of legality and liberalism. But at the same time, he had to be paralyzed, so that outside the state there would be a free hand to attack the proletariat on every front, even the most lawful and moderate, by any means necessary, including the most violent, heedless of democratic, legal, or sentimental concerns of prejudice. In terms of conservatism, fascism further a bet that this perhaps been the greatest stroke of luck, not merely by circumstances but of the very mistake of the workers and socialist parties and organizations, had provided an outstanding answer to the needs of the part of the bourgeoisie. The much preached and yearned for revolution had failed to arrive, in spite of all the favorable openings, and in a sense it could be argued that it was not wanted. But the fact that he had hovered like a threat for nearly 2 years was enough to trigger a counter-revolution. Those were there was a counter-revolution without there having been a revolution, a real preventive counter-revolution proper, of which fascism had been the most active and impressive factor. The bourgeoisie, which had not managed to weaken the proletariat through the indirect weapons of war, and had instead achieved the opposite effect, due to the particularities of the Italian situation, renewed its pledge to succeed this time through the free, sprung, concrete activity of illegal fascist violence, lawful government repression, and economic pressure derived from unemployment, partly inevitable but also in part deliberately contrived as a means of tightening the noose of the workers. Had the proletariat resisted the first fascist attack partly with the requisite vigor and violence and the necessity combined, fascism would have been stillborn. Instead, once the proletariat up instead to appeal passively to the law, even that weak trench was demolished by the enemy from many sides, since given that the socialists proved to be the weaker, the police and security forces no longer had any scruples about showing themselves allied with the fascists in the light of day, and the concerned onslaught by illegal and lawful force, to which the judiciary would shortly be added, began. Initially reluctant, capitalism and the government, those in government, by which is meant, if not this or that minister personally, then definitely the higher civil service, the prefects, the chiefs of police, etc., realized that fascism was a useful weapon and so ensured that it was given every assistance in terms of funding and arms, turning the blind eye to its breaches of the law and were necessary covering its back through intervention by armed force which, on the pretext of restoring order, would rush to the aid of the fascists. However, the latter would begin to take a beating instead of throwing one out. It would be naivete itself of revolutionaries to ask capitalism and the state to target fascism, with repressive measures that might otherwise produce further harmful effect. Moreover, any repression that goes beyond the legit self-defense, any government backlash based upon jails and handcuffs always has a criminal impact of its own, and revolutionaries cannot should not be calling for arrest and conviction, handcuffs, and jail terms. In early revolutionary socialists and workers would see an end to government and capitalism convenes with fascism, only when they summon up their own capacity for resistance, not sporadically and fitful, not more or less as individuals or groups, or in any unduly localized way, but across the board. When it comes to the demanding a rights, there is only one thing the workers will ask for, that they be given equal treatment and be left free to defend themselves every time that they are attacked, and defend themselves with the same resource as the fascists, to wit their own organization, their own meetings, their own flags, their own beliefs, their own lies. They will be entitled to ask that the police and courts not reduce them to conditions of somebody whose arms are tied while the others give it a savage beating. Or let the capitalist state cast aside all hypocrisy and stop playing two parts in a farce and take direct responsibility for the repression of the workers. But these are pointless demands, unless backed by real force, both moral and material, and can only be pressed by the way of token demonstration of one's right and for propaganda purpose. In a point of fact, Italian jails are filled with workers, and the heaviest sentence rained down on workers who during clashes made mistakes of using violence to defend themselves from the fascists. Given the war, given that its only real preventive remedy against it, revolution, was not forthcoming, fascism or something of the sort was inevitable. The fascists and those of their leader who honestly believe that they are in charge of the movement are in fact merely agents of the phenomena that is stronger than them, and by which they are dragged along. There is no movement less idealistic and more preoccupied with material success than fascism. It's obsessed by its own material interests with the material interests of the ruling class. Fascism has the entire working class in its sights with its most spectacular acts of violence and vandalism, no matter how many argue the opposite, and the working class is being targeted precisely because it poses a threat to capitalist profit and trespass against the interests of shopkeepers and employers, in that today it has represented an erosion and fragment of property rights. Fascism is rather unmoved by anything else. From the word go, what was under attack was not Bolshevism, but the proletariat as a whole. Activist fascism served but also exploited the bourgeoisie sphere of the Bolshevism, but it was also primarily the instrument and creature of capitalism's salvation for the proletariat. In fact, in very locality, In every region, the fascist greatest violence was not reserved for their assault upon a certain political faction. The very one they were arguing was a menace to the country, to the fatherland, etc. According to the fascists, Italy and the proletariat faced a different enemy in every district. They were party or organized that enjoyed the widest support and largest membership among the proletariat in that particular location. The destructive frenzy made no distinction between the various bodies, leagues or Camal de Labor, placements baroques or federation, libraries or newspapers, consumers cooperatives or production cooperatives, workers' mutual societies or leisure circles, cafes, inns, or private homes, just as long they had to belong to the workers. In all of these conflicts and countless attacks, countless proletariat had lost their lives, and those wrapped in funeral shrouds laid to rest in the mute earth has also been drawn from every persuasion and outlook. Catholics as well as anarchists, Republicans as well as socialists, communists as well as reformists, or non-partisan workers. The only reason why they targeted by murderous revolvers was because they were workers, toilers. What more telling evidence could there be that the fascist guerrilla war is not waged against this or that specific party, but against the working class as a class? The aim is to dismantle a stronghold everywhere, to focus on the proletariat's resistance to capitalism, and the intention is to cut down anyone who successfully defends the workers and earns their trust, no matter what color they may fly. Anybody making serious effort to defend themselves and use violence in legitimate self-defense soon found out that the security forces will weigh in on the side of the fascists and against the victims. That which is the fascist case has been endorsed, embedded, tolerated, or benevolently contained is violently, savagely repressed in the case of subversives. In weighing up the violence of the two sides involved in this guerrilla warfare, the greatest mistake would be considered only the bloody encounter that had claimed the odd victims. Although the latter may be many, the repressive exception to the rule. The worst violence, the type that leaves the worst legacy of resentment behind it, is the day-to-day sword that kills, not one or two or three people, but rather threatens an entire class. The use of the culture offending the human dignity which many cherish more than life itself. Destroy through its destruction of the worker's body, or cooperate at the economy standing a well behind an entire group, trampling the most basic elements of everybody's freedom, banishing all security and striking terror, not in a few or more or less responsible figures, but a whole population, and members of the working class, or people who refuse to join the fascio. Even should these people be politically inactive, indifferent, or naive, and this sort of violence, while it is less lethal, less bloody aftermath, surface daily just about everywhere. It's almost exclusively the handiwork of the fascists. In certain districts, it has become so run-of-the-mill that it's no longer subject of complaint or comment, and it's not even mentioned by the subversive press. Even if we add such violence to the other sort, to the more murderous violence upon which is the press is more inclined to concentrate, then any comparison between fascist violence and the workers' violence becomes impossible. In its program, fascism set out its inspiration to govern Italy, to restore a strong sovereign state, to revive and protect the social functioning of private ownership. So it's a program of struggle not just against revolution but also against socialism and against the proletariat which strives for equality and freedom, liberation from wage slavery, and the endless exploitation of its labor by any route. Whether or not this program brings success to its party, which owes its origins and name to fascism, out and out fascism as we know it today, which consists of systematically destroying and smashing the proletarian's political and economic organization by one means or another, especially by violent bullying means. The fascism which peculiarly dear to the ruling classes, which feasts upon their aid and protection, the fascism which the industrialists and landowners depend to put pressure on the workers and peasants to accept lower wages and additional work. The fascism that is pretty much an umbrella for the parasitical and militaristic class with their dreams of state of siege and military dictatorship. In short, the fascism of culture, revolver, and arson, the one that hopes to summon the crisis generated by the war through a preventive counter-revolution. That fascism is not going to walk away from violence and will carry on being what it is, unless it's defeated by a greater force. It has become an organism, and such cannot counteract suicide, no matter the relative logicality of its situation and pointlessness of its action in overall political and social terms. Democracy has been chasing its shadow for over 100 years and devised all sorts of shapes for it. But no matter what the form, the state has remained the champion of the interests of one class against another, the supporter and ally of the ruling class against the oppressed classes. Fascism in Italy has been an obvious instance of this, laying the democratic view of the state to rest once and for all. When an action breaches the state's law, embracing violence as a method and employed in accordance to its whims, over and above and in defiance of the law. It is in a state of rebellion. The state has to weather the war to steer it back to normality, the violent arm and contemptuous violence that it merits, then drowns it in blood if needed be. But in order to do that, it needs to have an interest in so doing in such a terrible undertaking, must hold out the promise of reward that outweighs the expenditure. Now, insofar as fascism usurps the state and relegates to the secondary position, the state might be induced to get rid of it, while in others stronger interests and dark dangers would tether it from taking on a force which, while it may well be a competitor and disrespectful, is yet not its enemy, not an opponent. Its institution but rather seek to reinforce them, albeit by means that run the risk of compromising them, and above all champion the same social interests, the same class privileges, which the state itself must guard. Fascism is an ally of the state, and in some demanding inconvenient, embarrassing, and subordinate ally of all these things, but an ally nonetheless. How could the state give a serious thought to destroy it? It may be that fascism, albeit moderate certain of the most irksome features which are offensive to humane feelings, may survive and consolidate as instruments for violent compulsion. Some swore of Damocles to then constantly cover the heads of the working class, so that the latter can never fully at ease anywhere, even within the parameters of the law, and forever feel for its right being violated by some unforeseen and arbitrary violence. In which case, for the working class, and for all those who embrace its causes, for all we see the proletariat's liberation from wage slavery as prerequisite to greater justice, greater well-being, and greater freedom for all, the only object is to kill off fascism, to make its eradicated a target without retreating into some Muslim-like patient, without trusting facility to fate, to natural evolution, the process of decomposition, the laws of economic and other kindred expression for which men disguise their laziness and their reluctance to make requisite effort of will. Killing off fascism, of course, is not an excuse for slaughtering fascist personnel. Often, the violence deployed against the latter merely feeds it rather than killing it off. Those attacked by the fascists at specified times in specific places should defend themselves whoever they can, and may is also natural and unavoidable. However, embarking upon a material struggle against fascism as an organism itself, seeing no other enemy but this, would be a dismal affair. It would be like stripping the branches from a poisonous tree while leaving the trunk intact, like striking off some tentacle instead of striking the octopus's head. It may be possible to inflict few partial defeats of fascism this way and claim fascist lists, but only insert to make fight all the more bitter and might well bolster fascism and help to make it even sturdier organism. The fight against fascism can only be waged effectively if it struck through the political and economic institution, which is an outgrowth and form where it draws substances. Moreover, revolutionaries aiming to bring down capitalism and the state, if they were allowed themselves to be drawn by fascism like a lightning bolt diverted by the lightning rod, and to devote all of their efforts and exhaust themselves in the fight against fascism alone, will be playing into the hands of the very institution they would like to see demolished. Using the fascists as a boogeyman, the capitalist state could not only succeed in protecting itself and living an easier life, but also succeed in persuading segments of the proletariat to work in cooperation with it and to make its sides. Even today, while on the one hand, capitalism uses fascism to blackmail the state itself uses fascism to blackmail the proletariat, sending out the message. Give up on your dreams of political economic appropriation and order your leaders to cooperate with me in strengthening the institution of state, or I will stand by as you beaten and killed by the fascists. If they are not up to the task, I will let them helping hand myself. As long as the proletariat is accustomed to view fascism as a special enemy against whom it was a special fight, the government's blackmail ploy can only succeed, and for so long as the blackmail does its job, the government has an interest in continued survival of fascism, which is more or less disposed to follow its instructions. The bourgeoisie has learned how to put this weapon to use, and if the proletariat fail to destroy it will do so by means of practical demonstration that it knows how to dash it from bourgeois hands the latter may, if they set it aside for the moment, picking up at the first opportunity. Another great analysis is the written in 1943 by Marie-Louise Bernet, written called Italy After 1918. Part 1. The Revolutionary Period 1919 to 1921. The Italian people had played an unenthusiastic part during the last war. They had been strongly impregnated by the socialist and anarchist ideas they saw in the war, not a struggle for democracy, but another imperialist conflict. The left-wing parties did not betray their internationalist ideas as openly as they did in other countries. A section of the Socialist Party opposed the war throughout, while the great majority gave it only lukewarm support. The anarchist movement refused to take part in this imperialist bloodbath and consistently opposed the war. The ruling class, in order to obtain some support for the Italian people, had to bribe them with promises. They assured the workers they would get better conditions after the war and they would give the land to the peasants. But then peace came, they showed no willingness to keep their promises. The country found itself extremely weakened. It had lost 1 million men in the war, and those who came back found no work to do. Meanwhile, the cost of life had gone up tremendously. The bourgeoisie, on the other hand, had done well out of the war and was more of itself and arrogant than ever. In particular, the agrarians, the land bourgeoisie, were resolved to do their utmost to prevent the peasants from gaining any concession. In 1919, the whole country was seething with discontent. The workers and peasants, tired of waiting for the improvements promised them, began to take matters into their own hands. The bourgeois and nationalist elements were frustrated by the Allies' denial of any share of the war booty to Italy. Just as in Germany, the Versailles Treaty was stepping stones for the Nazis. In Italy, it formed bases for fascism. Strikes, lootings of shops, occupations, the land became sporadic and unorganized way. The general election, which took place in November 16, 1919, they gave the Socialists 2,846,593 votes, while the bourgeoisie parties received 3.5 million votes. The new liberal government showed itself incompetent both to resolve the internal economic problem and to gain an Italian territorial aggrandizement around the diplomatic tables. It was, however, resolved in one thing, and that was to crush any workers' revolt. It created a royal guard which mercilessly crushed all demonstrations and strikes. But in spite of the government's repression, the movement of strike intensified itself. It was mainly due to the economic situation and the disproportionate increase of the cost of life. But already in April 1920, the general strike of Turin showed the workers wanted more than economic gains and they aimed to control the industry which belongs to the people by right because they had built them with their toil, because they were working them. The returning workers set up factory councils and declared their intention to control the factories themselves. All over Italy strikes simply took place and the railway workers refused to move the troops which the government wanted to send to suppress the revolt. The strike lasted 10 days and was finally crushed by the overwhelming forces of repression, though its having been unable to obtain sufficient support for the rest of the Italian workers. Already we see in the Turing strike the wavering and uncertain attitude which the Socialist Party and the trade unions, the General Confederation of Labor, were to play all through these years of revolt. Wherever the working class showed the desire to overthrow capitalist oppression, they used all their power to prevent them from doing so, while the anarchists and syndicalists appealed to the Italian people to support the burning workers by striking by all other means at their disposal. The socialists refused to support them by calling a general strike. The socialist organ, Avanti, in its Milan edition, even expressed regret that the strike should have taken place. Worker strikes and expropriation of the land by the workers, particularly in the south of the peninsula, continued were unable to maintain order. The Nitti government fell and was replaced by a new liberal government with Giolitti and all slight politician at its head, and with the socialist Labroglia as Minister of Labor. The people showed their opposition to the government by increasing demonstrations. The most important took place in Ancona and port of the Ancona coast, where popular riot took place and regime tested to Albania refused to embark. In solidarity with the mutiny, a general strike took place in the surrounding provinces and ended only when the government promised to abandon the protectorate of Albania. On August 28th, the occupation of the factories by the metal workers all over Italy began. The direct cause was the refusal of the industrialists to put into practice a collective contract of work who had been forced to them by the strikes of August and September 1919, and to raise wages in proportion to the cost of living. Afraid that the police would come to help the bourgeois and occupy the factories, the workers took possession of them themselves, and in vain did the government. Through this labor ministry, Laboria attempted reconciliation. The workers refused all compromises. The workers showed that the aim of the strike was not merely to attain and increase wages. In many parts, they armed themselves to defend the factory they had seized. They formed workers' councils to assure proper running of industry, and the Federation of Cooperation paid the wages. The moment seemed right to deal a final blow to the capitalist class and the established workers' control all over Italy. The enthusiasm, the militancy of the masses was at its height. After a year of local strikes and conflict, the people had, in a united effort, manifested resolution to get rid of the old regime. But both the socialist and the communist leadership were afraid of revolution. The most extraordinary pretexts were put forward. Italy had no coal, no iron, not enough wood to suffice itself. A revolution was bound to fail. Even Lenin thought that the revolution would be premature and told Angela Balabanos, the old socialist militant, that Italy could not make a revolution because she lacked coal and raw materials. So the Socialist Party and the Reformist Trade Union, instead of the following the masses, helping them to strike down the capitalist system, lost themselves in the futile controversies and only offered the workers empty resolutions. On the 4th and 5th of September, the General Confederation of Labor and the Socialist Party, who were affiliated in the same way as they are in this country, made to decide to intensify the struggle, but then did nothing. A week later, they met again and adopted a solution advocated by the trade union secretary to get out of the factories and attack the bourgeoisie in its central organ, the state. This fine piece of socialist sophistry had the most terrible consequences for the Italian working class. It marked the beginning of a reign of reaction which led to fascism. And this is why ordinary anarchists are always right, and people who are socialists or communists but still believe in hierarchies, like Marxists, betray the working class every time when they're actually trying to achieve something. On the 15th September 1920, delegates from the workers and the industrialists met. Under the presidency of the Prime Minister Giolitti at Turin, he proposed the formation of a commission of 6 members representing the Confederacy of Industry and 6 members representing the General Confederation of Labor, which would establish a sort of control of the industry. No compromise was free at first because of the intransigent attitude of the capitalists, but when the negotiations were resumed in Rome, a compromise was arrived at this. This scheme was a clever move on the part of the astute premier. The factories were evacuated, the workers lost all of their power, and the projected law was forgotten in some pigeonhole. But while the Italian workers felt betrayed, weakened, and hopeless, the bourgeois prepared itself to prevent similar experience from occurring again. The occupation of the factory, which could have marked the downfall of the ruling class, was on the contrary the signal for the capitalists to re-lead their forces began to look for a man who would give them a strong government capable to crush any attempt of revolt on the part of the workers. The fascists understood that the moment to act had come. On November 21st, 1920, they launched their first attack against the working class organization. From Bologna, the fascist offensive spread to Po Valley. In the meantime, the government reorganized the police, and the royal guard was recruited among the youth and well trained. The forces of the reaction came close together. The capitalists, the royalists, the clerics, army men joined hands. The Socialist Party did not or would not see the fascist danger. It merely concerned itself with internal discussion, being attacked and displayed by the activities of the communists who were still in the party at the time. It was then the most important and strongly organized party in Italy. It counted almost a quarter of a million members, and the General Confederation level counted to 2 million. It had 156 members in the parliament and 2,162 communes, i.e., municipalities, more administrated by socialists. The Communist Party was formed under the Congress of Licourt in 15th through 20th January 1921, and the Socialist Party refused to accept the 21 conditions imposed by Moscow. Its main aim was not to fight reaction but to attack the socialists, who, like Cerati, had refused to become a servile tool of the Kremlin. The Communist Party was formed of many dishonest elements who accepted the disreputable role of breaking up long-established parties and selecting old working-class leaders in order to obtain favors and money which Moscow bestowed upon its faithful servants. The communists had plenty of reason to criticize the reformist socialist leader like Cerati, but did not choose to carry on the controversy on theoretical and tactical grounds. With their now well-known methods, they tried to discredit them by attempting to blacken their private lives and use slander and blackmail, provocateurs, and spies. This only weakened and demoralized the working class, so that the growth of the communists in Italy was an important factor to the rise of fascism. The Russian Revolution had inspired the entire workers. At the example of the Russian comrades, they have formed workers' council. They had declared a general strike against to protest against interventions in Russia. But Lenin and the Communist International destroyed the inspiration of the Russian Revolution had given the entire workers. Seeing that they could not control the entire working class movement, the Communist International set about disorganizing and smashing them. When Lenin died, Enrico Malatesta wrote Anarchist Daily, Umaniata Nova, Lenin is dead, long live liberty. He was expressing the judgment of history. The anarchist movement had always had a strong influence on the Italian masses. Its federalist character appealed to the country which had been only recently united and when the central government was weak and unpopular. Its recognition of the important role which the peasants should play in the revolution wanted to support the countryside. The influence which Bakunin exerted was felt long after his death. The Italian section of the International always refused to accept Marx's dictatorship. The socialist movement, which was formed by the former anarchist Andrea Costa, was for a long time influenced by the anti-parallelism of the anarchists and was under their influence, much more ready to take part in direct action than its German or British counterpart. The anarchists also had a strong influence among the Bourgeois du Travail, which grouped all the trades locally and often remained independent of the Trade Union Confederation, or the TUC. In 1912, anarchist syndicalists formed their own unions. It was very active in 1914 during the June Revolt, which was called the Red Week. At Ancona on the 7th of June, in a conflict with the police, three workers had been killed. Ancona, a Republican and anarchist town where Malatesta, then in Italy, asserted strong influence, immediately declared a general strike. From there it spread all over Italy. Revolt took place in Ancona, in Romagna, Florence, and Naples. The army fraternized with the people, towns' halls were occupied with revolutionaries. The syndicalists led the revolt, but the General Confederation of Labor gave the order its members to resume work. Of the activities of the Italian Syndicalist Union, Armando Borghi, who was its secretary from 1990, wrote in a letter, during the 4 years from 1990 to 1922, our action was one of the vanguard, not only of theory but of action. We often tried and we sometimes succeed in putting the leaders of the General Confederation of Labor in front of the accomplished facts of serious revolutionary movement, but we did not succeed in breaking the tutelage in which the reformist leader held the mass. He adds, I still think the revolution in Italy at the time was necessary, like a natural birth, and that abortion which we saw was a catastrophe. France, Spain, etc., will have altered their course, and the whole of Europe will see things very different from Mussolini. The Syndicalist Union was at the head of all the strikes and the movements of revolt, as also was the Anarchist Union. They did not carry on in a sectarian way. When working class was struggling for the defense of its own interests, it joined socialist and trade unions in the fight, tried to carry it as fast as possible. While the members of the Socialist Party left, discouraged by the reformist attitude, the membership of the Syndicalist Union grew rapidly and reached more than a half a million. At the beginning of 1921, cleavage between the working class and the bourgeoisie had reached its climax. On the one side stood the working class organization counting millions of members bound to reformist leaders and revolutionary syndicalist anarchist minority unable to thrown behind itself by masses. On the other side, the liberal and the Catholic parties resorted to defend by all means at their disposal in the interest of the capitalist class. Mussolini became their tool. With a handful of fascists, the protection of the police, and the complicity of the government was able in a few years to disband the working class organization and conquer power. 2. The rise of fascism in Italy. The Italian workers who, during the occupation of the factories in August and September 1920, had seized the opportunity to deal a final blow at the bourgeoisie. They failed to do so, and from that moment they sought to retreat the battle against the ruling class and rapidly growing fascist danger. The government began to imprison working class militants, while fascist hooligans who act with complete impunity. Mussolini began an organized struggle against the working class organization. Their offices were burned, their centers destroyed, their members murdered. The mention of the government's operating power was given when Chiolitti, then Prime Minister, Other Armando Borghi, the anarchist secretary at the Syndicalist Union, and Enrico Malatesta, the old anarchist militant, to be arrested. The workers had been too demoralized by the defeat which followed the occupation of the factory to put out any serious opposition. The situation was different in February 1920, when the government had tried to arrest Malatesta at Tombola, a little-known town near Leghorn. Immediately, all major towns of Tuscany declared general strike, and the rally men decided to stop the trains in the whole of central Italy. Before they could do so, Malatesta was released. Anarchists and syndicalists all over Italy organized themselves demonstrations and strikes in order to obtain the liberation of their comrade, but they received no solidarity from the socialist organization. The organ of the Socialist Party, Avanti, published in large type of the following appeal: "We beg our workers' comrade most earnestly to pay no attention to any appeals for action until such appeals shall have been duly passed by the party's central organ and by economic organization competent to deal with them." All the party's leaders did in order to show their solidarity to Malatesta and Borghi was to decide that an 1 hour strike protest should be called. Thanks to the complicity of the Social Reformers organization, the government was able to keep Malatesta and Borghi in prison for 9 months. When they were released, the reactionary movement had gained such tremendous ground, the working class was unable to react. On May 15, 1921, the government decided to dissolve the parliament and to call a new election. The election in such a period of unrest spelled civil war, and the government was well aware of it. It used them in order to participate in the crushing of the left-wing movement. All over Italy, acts of violence took place. The fascist took its opponents to intensify their attacks. The Socialist Party retained, however, the same numbers of votes as it had received at the previous election, while Mussolini, together with the 30 nationalist and fascist deputies, entered the parliament. The Avanti declared that fascist reaction had been buried under the avalanche of red votes, but in reality the initiative already belonged to the bourgeoisie. The Socialist Party and the General Confederation of Labour refused to take their action against the fascist and socialist paramilitary groups, adopted the policy of wait and see. They refused to join the government, and they equally refused to act against it. While their leaders sat tight in their comfortable armchairs, the workers were faced by unemployment, rising prices, government repression, and fascist provocation. Sounds familiar? On June 6th of July, the attempt in 1921, attempt was made to unify the working class forces to meet the fascists with more than words. And a pact of proletarian alliance was signed in Rome by working class organizations and workers' militias. The Adatti Rossi was formed. The Socialists already gave it lukewarm support. They declared in their paper, De Avanti, there was no use trying to use force against the overwhelming forces of the government. The Socialist Fascist Pact. Unwilling to use force, the Socialist Party preferred to resort to intrigue and compromise. On 3rd of August 1921, in the office of the President of the Parliament, the Socialist leaders signed a peace treaty with the Fascists. They promised to cooperate to prevent any acts of violence and reprisal and to respect each other's right to propaganda and organization. The Socialist and Fascist leaders shook hands across the bodies of the peasants and workers assassinated by Mussolini's henchmen. This pact was a clever move on the part of Mussolini to gain time and to increase and organize his forces. For a few months, fascist fighting decreased, but this did not last long. While socialist leaders severely reminded the rank and file to respect the pact, Mussolini renewed his attacks. At the Socialist Congress of Rome in January 1922, the peasants and the workers delegated from the region invaded by the fascists brought hundreds of proofs of the fact that the fascist party had not respected the pact. They talk of their burned buildings, of the cooperatives destroyed, of their murdered comrades, and they ask for action. But the social leadership remained unmoved and declared its unshakable faith in the parliamentary tactic. Last attempt to resist. Another attempt was made to coordinate with the working class forces. A workers' alliance between the General Confederation of Labour, the Syndicalist Union, and Railroad Union was formed. It was aimed to oppose the alliance of workers forced to the coordination of the reaction. This alliance might be able to stop the rise of fascism, but it came too late when the working class was demoralized, weakened, and divided. The Workers' Alliance made, however, a last attempt to oppose fascism. On July 31st, 1924, it declared a general strike. The strike was successful and completed, but the streets belonged to the fascists. After 3 days of strike, they started to attack. They were defeated in the revolutionary towns of Parma 40, but they were victorious in Milan and the strike finished with the defeat of the proletariat. The fascist onslaught continued from the Po Valley to the attack spread of Tuscany to the Puglia. The socialists went on advocating the return to legal means to fair competition between parties. The climax of naivety was reached when the socialist deputy Filippo Turati called on the king to bring him to wish the proletariat for liberty and remind him that his duty was to defend the constitution which he had taken the oath. The king's answer was a few days afterwards to call Mussolini to power. The March on Rome. Mussolini, once having helped to defeat the workers, set himself to conquer power. He had to win the support of the big capitalists and royalty, who, once the revolutionary danger passed, might have wished thank him and dismiss him. But the series of intrigues, and by declaring himself prepared to accept and defend the king, who he had always attacked, Mussolini managed to get the support of the capitalists, who gave him 20 millions to prepare the march on Rome and for the royal family. Sure of his ground, Mussolini declared from Naples on October 24, 1922, "If do not give us power, we shall take it by marching on Rome," says Mussolini. The government by that time had resigned, but on learning of Mussolini's declaration of war, it published a decree putting the country in a state of siege. All civil authority had to be surrounded by the army, which took steps to prevent any armed push on the part of the fascists. Mussolini had only limited force at his disposal, and if the army had opposed him, he would have been lost. But the king came to the rescue. He refused to sign a decree putting the country under a state of siege. Instead, he called Mussolini to Rome to form a new government. Mussolini marched on Rome, comfortably installed in a sleeping car. On October 30, he had formed his government. In Rome, his troops marched before the king and the royal family. All over Italy, his followers celebrated with no violence. Parliament did not put up any opposition. He had been taken by surprise, and once again, it decided to wait for events. Mussolini immediately took measures in favor of the bourgeoisie. All legislation in favor of the workers was repealed. Meanwhile, fascist terrorism increased. On December 18, 1922, 12 workers were massacred in Turin. The organizer of the engineer workers, Pietro Ferrero, an anarchist, was killed. Everywhere, socialists, anarchists, syndicalists were murdered under the very eyes of the police, who never took any step against the fascists. From March of Rome to Matteotti's murder on June 1924, Mussolini consolidated his forces. He managed to confuse and fool Parliament with clever speeches where he kept everybody guessing as to what his intentions were, while his band carries on merciless struggle against the last working class bastions. The election, which took place in April 1924, only gave the fascists another excuse for violence. In Parma, the socialist candidate Piccinini was assassinated. Matteotti's murder. On June 10, 1924, Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist deputy, was kidnapped in full daylight in Rome. This murder could have been just another anonymous fascist crime if a man had not taken the number of the car where Matteotti had disappeared and reported to the police. Matteotti's body was not found until after 3 months of search, but the inquest led the police to the government's doorstep. Mussolini, in order to clear himself, accused all of his corroborators, one after the other: Rossi, Finzi, General De Bono, and Tumini. They defend themselves by accusing him. No doubt could be left as Mussolini having ordered the murder. Public opinion was aroused. Fascist methods were well known, and Matteotti's name was just one more in a long list of fascist crimes. But this was a unique case, where the police had by accident found the murderers, and where Mussolini's hand was clearly shown. It might have been possible to start a movement at the time, which would have overthrown Mussolini's government. The workers' organization proposed to declare a general strike, but the Socialist Parliamentary Group thought such action unwise. Instead, they issued a declaration condemning the murder. Again, in January 1925, Mussolini's government seemed on the point of collapse. Rossi, who was implicated in Matteotti's murder, wrote a memorandum of the method used by Mussolini to crush his political opponents. After such revelation, two cabinet ministers felt compelled to resign. Instead of allowing a government crisis to take place and a new cabinet to be formed, the king hastened to accept two fascist ministers, whom Mussolini proposed to replace the others. In October 1925, Mussolini published his version of the murder. The kidnapping was merely a joke, the murder an accident. The popular reaction on Matteotti's murder, which put Mussolini's position in peril, made him realize how quickly he had to act to prevent public opinion from expressing itself. All through 1925, particularly after Sanibone's attempt on Mussolini's spine, measures were taken to suppress the right of association and the liberty of press. If the only expression revolt took from now on and were in the form of individual actions against Mussolini and his acolytes and underground propaganda. In both of the fields, the anarchists showed courage and initiation. Of the 7 attempts against Mussolini, 4 were carried out by anarchists. The lesson should be drawn. The events which led Mussolini conquer of power clearly showed that reformist and legal methods are of no avail in the fight against reaction and fascism. The ruling class is only prepared to adhere to legality to respect to their own rules of the game, as long as it is sustained. When this situation is in danger, they use violence, corruption, assassination. The Socialist Party indeed made the mistake of thinking that the capitalist and the fascist leader would be prepared to accept their fair competition between parties and they will respect their peace treaties, but they will be moved by appeal to decency and honesty. All through those 7 years of conflict, they play into the hands of the ruling class. They continue to rely on election results, while the fascists have clearly declared if they will not give it power, they will conquer it, revolver in hand. Uh, while the socialists scrupulously respected a government sold to the capitalist class. The fascists did not hesitate to assassinate the socialist candidate who they could not silence, as examples during the April 1924 election when socialist candidate Pacinini was killed by the fascists. They kept relying on the numbers of seats they had in parliament as the surest guarantee against fascism. Where it was obvious when Mussolini relied more on political intrigues and on forced than democratic methods. On the 15th of May 1925, 1921 elections, the Nationalists and the Fascists had 30 deputies, while the Socialists had 138 members, and Communists 15. But this did not correspond to the real balance of power. The Fascists had the government, the police, and in some cases the army on their sides. They could upset any majority the Socialists had in parliament. If the Italian workers had relied more on their class weapons, strikes, and insurrections, rather than on the voting paper, they would have not been defeated. If they can occupy that factory, if they had control of the industry rather than relying on the government to get that control, then the rise of fascism would have been impossible. The anarchists advocate all through the strikes and expansion of the movement, and Melitos's speech to Milan factory workers after they have returned to work showed that he fully grasped and the tragic consequence this compromise with the bourgeoisie will have for the Italian workers. This is how he described the fight between the General Confederation level and the Employers Association, and I quote from Enrico Malatesta. You who are celebrating the great victory of the senator in Rome of this agreement are deceiving yourself. In reality, the victory belonged to priority, to the government, and to the bourgeoisie, who find themselves safe from the piercing over which they have been hanged. To speak of victory while Rome Agreement puts you back once more onto the exploitation of bourgeoisie is a lie. If you give up possession of the factory to do so with the conviction that you had lost a great battle, and with the full intention of resuming the struggle at the first opportunity, pursuing it to an end, you will then drive the employers from the factories and you will not allow them to re-enter till they come in as workmen, on the equality with yourself content to live by working for themselves and others. Nothing is lost provided you do not delude yourself with the fantasy that you're getting a victory. The famous decree at the control of the factory is to dupe you for the will to tend to the creation of the new class of employees, i.e., the officials or bureaucrats, who thus sprung from your bosom, will not defend your interests, but the new situation created for them and would tend also to harmonize your interests with those of the bourgeoisie, the interests of the wolf with those of the lamb. Do not believe those of your leaders who mock you for putting off the revolution from day to day. The revolution, you yourself had to make it whenever the opportunity presents itself, without waiting for orders that never come, or if they do come, only instruct you to give up the fight. Have confidence in yourself. Have faith in your future. You will conquer. The socialists displayed the same lack of revolutionary realism when the working class came to the attack by the fascist hooligans. They rely upon the police, which will never defend them nor persecute the attackers. And the attempt to right direction was made when a kind of workers' defense corps was formed, but it never reached the power and efficiency of, say, the Irish Citizen Army. No serious effort was made to defend the workers' organization, buildings, or left-wing newspaper presses. When the Avanti building was burned in Milan by the fascists, no attempt was made to defend in spite of the fact that such an attack had to be expected at any moment. It's almost incredible to think that an organization with 2 million members should have its property destroyed without any defense being put up. The fascists were a very small minority, but the straight lay in the fact that they knew the police would not molest them. If the workers had resisted in an organized way, they would have been able to crush the fascist revolt in the bud. The organization of the workers' defense would have been equally useful when strike took place. The workers were able to stage general strike, which covered the whole country and lasted several days. But they left the streets of the fascists, who, while they could not break the strikes, were able to burn union buildings and attack and murder socialist and anarchist militants. Unlike them, the Dublin workers understood the danger. This is why they formed their own defense during 1913 transport workers' strike. The lack of workers' defense was partly due to the lack of unity among the Italian workers. While the bourgeoisie presented a united front against the working class, the Workers' Party lost themselves in an endless squabble. The Italian anarchist movement understood the danger of disunity and always advocated a joint action against the government repression and fascism. At the Congress of the Anarchist Union held in Bologna on July 1 to 4, 1920, a union of rank and file members belonging to all parties was advocated freedom. September 1929 gives the following report of the discussion which took place and resolution which was adopted. I quote, a discussion took place on the platform of the United Front of the Italian Proletariat, which is divided on the industrial field in the Reformist General Confederation of Labor. The Italian syndicalists and the very class-conscious Catholic trade unions, politically, the workers belong either to the Socialist Party, which is different wing from the Reformists, to the Communist parliamentarians, or to the extremely revolutionary Republicans and the anarchists. The Catholic People Party is also very strong. Besides these, there exist several autonomous groups of all tendencies. The secession had heretofore stood in the way of united action. Malatesta has repeatedly pointed out the great need for united action among all parties. In several localities, there is today a already incumbent united front, whilst in others the attainment of this object is difficult and even impossible. The following resolution was passed. The Congress authorized and advised the formation of small local groups of action outside the party and its city organization in the different localities, consisting of all those elements which will declare themselves ready to go into action at the first desired opportunity and to fight with all their means against the existing institution. End quote. When one studies of the history of Hitler's rise to power, one is struck by the fact that German workers learned nothing from the experience of the Italian proletariat. All workers all over the world are going to commit the same mistake, making the sacrifice of their comrades unless bringing terrible suffrage upon themselves. This is the problem of fascism. We must resist in any form, in every way, no matter the cost. We need to learn the lesson of fascism